Hello everyone, welcome to Here We Go. We are starting another exciting chapter on Josekis. Actually, just kidding. It's not that exciting. It's actually very daunting for beginners to learn Josekis. So this chapter is very hard to teach and pretty hard to learn. So for the previous chapters, I had a very good idea going in. What to teach, what patterns to use. I had everything planned out, but not for this chapter because it's difficult to teach. I don't know how this chapter will be like. I don't even know how many videos there's gonna be. I'll keep it simple. Sometimes it's hard to keep it simple because your opponent wants to play something more complicated. So we need to figure out how to keep things simple, but if things get complicated, you also have to know how to respond. And that's the hard part. So how complicated can it get? Well, it can get as complicated as this. Ooh. So this so-called joseki has 36 moves just on this corner. And of course, there are many variations. I just showed you all of this in just 2 seconds. Doesn't make any sense to you. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me either. It's a very new AI joseki that professional players have kind of discovered. They're using it in their games. Super complicated. And should I cover this joseki in my chapter? Maybe, sometime down the line. Maybe video 599. It is totally pointless to just remember the sequence without knowing why. So that's why I'm hesitant to introduce all these very popular josekis without explaining everything. Because giving you such complicated sequences will only confuse you and will confuse most amateur players. So there is a 2021 book on AI josekis by a professional 9-dan player in China. And it covered more than 3,000 patterns and variations. Of course, most of those will be variations. So I am not going to cover 3,000 variations in this chapter, maybe 50, 100. We'll see. But that gives you an idea of just how many possibilities there are, right? Because these 36 moves right here, each move has many other possibilities. Some of those possibilities work, some of those do not. And exhausting all of these possibilities is really difficult and unnecessary for beginners. One complaint from amateur players about the AI Joseki book is that the book uses the word clearly, obviously, too often. And the players are like, it's only clear and obvious to professional players. A lot of the variations, sequences, possibilities are not that clear at all to amateur players. This chapter will try to avoid the confusion. And of course, you're welcome to try other joseki tutorials out there on the internet. There are some good ones, especially by professional players. And of course, you can watch videos by amateur players as well. As long as they explain things well, I think you can learn from them. But usually, they presume some basic knowledge about certain moves and certain patterns. So without knowing basic knowledge, without those presumptions, sometimes it might be a little difficult for beginners. So I'll try to break things down as much as possible, try to build everything from the ground up, and see what happens. And of course, most of those videos out there are super long, right? Even like 3 simple patterns might take half an hour to 1 full hour to explain. I've been trying to keep my videos short, so I'll see if I can keep these videos short as well. So when you're learning, you should expect some difficult concepts and a lot of subtle differences between the moves. Sometimes the moves might appear the same or very similar to beginners, but actually the professional players, higher level amateur players, those different patterns do make a huge difference. And I'll try to explain those differences. So what is joseki? That is the million-dollar question here. And you need to have a very good understanding of what it is. so you can approach it the right way when you're playing. Otherwise, you will feel a lot of pain, especially as a beginner, as a lower level amateur player. So joseki, literally speaking, if we translate it literally, it means something like a fixed sequence. But it's not accurate to call it fixed because it is not fixed, right? Because there are 3,000 potential variations from these so-called fixed sequences. So I would call it in English an accepted sequence. By accepted, I mean it's accepted by human experience, that both sides can accept this sequence. Both sides get something out of it, and both sides can be satisfied. It is relatively even. And how do we determine that? Of course, we can determine it by human experience, right? If a sequence doesn't really determine who wins and who loses, then it's probably pretty even. Also, we can look at the shapes that these sequences form and analyze how these shapes and patterns interact with the surrounding board position, with the overall board positions, right? So the overall board position is definitely something you should keep in mind when you're deciding which joseki to use. And of course, since 2016, there's been AI josekis, right? That's what the professional book has been about. It's 3,000 variations from AI josekis. And before that, there were human josekis that are completely outdated today. Even some of the most classic josekis from before 2016 are completely outdated. So that's another thing you should watch out for. If you're looking at tutorials, look at the date and look at whether they mention AI. If it's after 2016 and if they mention AI, it's probably good to learn. If the material is before 2016, then you should be more cautious because it might be outdated, meaning it's no longer even, and those sequences are bad for one side. So why are those human josekis outdated? Because humans with thousands of years of experience still couldn't figure out what's good for both sides. And that's pretty amazing, right? Thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of really smart people trying to figure out what's an acceptable and accepted sequence for both sides, and they got it wrong. AI just came out and said, hey, that's actually not even at all. That shouldn't be acceptable. So that's been the role of AI. But of course, you shouldn't worry too much about AI because AI still likes elegance, likes simplicity. So just learn the simple stuff from AI first. And then, as you grow stronger, get into the more complicated ones. And lastly, josekis also depend on your personal feelings or preferences or your style. For instance, if a joseki gives one side territory and the other side potential, you can choose. If you prefer to take territory, then you should choose a joseki that gives you territory. If you prefer potential, then you should choose a joseki that gives you potential. So you get to choose. So if you like potential but you end up with territory, even if it is a joseki, you may not like it, and the pattern may not benefit you because you're not good at taking territory early on. So it really depends on your own preferences and your own styles as well. So what are some alternatives to josekis? So by the way, all josekis stem from variations on the corner, right? I don't think there is any joseki that stems from the side or like from the center because that would be too unpredictable and too complicated, and that kind of varies every game, right? What happens in the center of the board. But what's more predictable and what human players have been exploring for thousands of years is what happens on these corners, right? And the latest book, as we know, has more than 3,000 variations. So alternatives to josekis can be a simple exchange, like the approach right here, number 5, and white can just answer like this. And this can be considered done for now, right? It's done for now. Black can play elsewhere, can play this, or do another approach, or do another corner closer, right? So black can play elsewhere. But this eventually will become some type of a sequence. that's more complicated than this, right? Because it's unclear whether this corner is white's territory, or will black come in here and take territory and white get the potential on the outside, or whether black will take this side down here and white takes the corner. So there are many possibilities here. But for now, both sides can leave it, right? So we can have a simple exchange as an alternative to a joseki. Or we can have this first pattern. This joseki really comes from a fight. It is just a fight that both sides can accept, right? It's pretty even. The result here is pretty even. And I will not try to explain the, the nitty gritty of this pattern because I cannot. I need to do enough research before I can teach it. So alternatives to joseki can also be fights. And that's where things get really complicated. And as a beginner, you should once again try to avoid these complicated josekis. But still, as a teacher, I'm a little torn between whether to completely avoid complicated patterns, because sometimes your opponent will want to play it, and sometimes it is difficult to avoid it. So I think eventually I will cover some of the more complicated josekis, but I will also try to teach you how to avoid those patterns. I would say most of the times they are avoidable. Sometimes they are not. So that's what's tricky about it. So as a beginner or lower level amateur, how should you learn? Well, for me, you can't really learn anything from my experience more than 20 years ago because, first of all, most of the patterns I learned as a kid are outdated. And second of all, because I learned everything in China, it involved a lot of rote learning, meaning you remember the sequences, and then when you're playing with other kids, we just kind of spat out all these sequences without thinking about it. For instance, if we were taught this 36 move joseki, then my friends and I would just remember these 36 moves and just play them in 15 seconds like this. And then the game will really start from here, right? We will not question why we just played these 36 moves on the corner. But of course, that is not a good way to approach the game of Go. It should be more interesting. It should involve more thinking than this. So a preview would be, we'll start with the start point, right? So there will be the approach like this. There will be the 3-3 invasion, which really is an invention by AI, especially this early on in the game. And then we'll analyze the 3-4 points, the approach, the different approaches. You can also have josekis with a corner closer. So for instance, if black plays the large knight's corner closer here with a 3-4 point, so 3 and 5. So white can actually play the attachment here and start josekis. So this is also very common these days in the age of AI. Pretty rare in the past, but now very common, right? So I'll teach you the basic moves of this attachment. And I'm pretty sure Michael Redman covers this as well, so you can check it out on his channel. Highly recommended. And then maybe we'll cover the 3-3 point, or the 3-5 point, or the 4-5 point, right? You can start josekis from these other points as well. So for each of these josekis, because the patterns start with simple moves, and then the variations get complicated. So for each video, or for each section, it will really be starting from a simple exchange, simple variation, and then it gets more complicated. So if it gets overwhelming, then please feel free to ignore the more complicated variations. But the beginning of each pattern, each section, should be the simple variations that you should learn as a beginner. But sometimes it is really difficult to teach the simple variations and the complicated variations separately. Wouldn't make sense to teach them separately. So I'll still put them together, but if it gets overwhelming, you can skip it or ask me questions if you don't understand anything here in the comments or in the email. It's in the About section on my channel. Other than teaching the real, popular, and up-to-date josekis, I will also tell you what josekis are outdated, right? So when you see them in books, you know that book is outdated. When you see those patterns played, you know who actually has an advantage in that situation because it is outdated no longer accepted for both sides. And lastly, maybe I will try to include some of the wrong moves you see in those variations as well. Of course, I'll cover plenty of wrong moves as I explain the variations, but there are some basic wrong moves, or what we call overplays. If you address them correctly, you will gain an advantage. But if you do not know how to respond to those overplays, those wrong moves, you might be put in a disadvantage by your opponent. So those are also very important to learn, especially for beginners, because beginners make all kinds of mistakes, and the patterns are usually mistakes upon mistakes. So whoever capitalizes on the opponent's mistakes wins the game. So I know that's a lot as an intro to a chapter, but I think those are important for you to know because it is a very complicated topic. So here are the main takeaways. So you should know what josekis are. I would call them accepted sequences that human beings, AI, have come up with over the years. And it also depends on the surrounding board position, overall board position, and your own styles and preferences. And number two, remember your task in this chapter as a beginner when you're learning joseki. You should try to learn and remember the simple variations, right? Remember the most basic ones, and then you should also learn how to avoid the complicated ones. Trust me, I will teach you how to avoid the complicated ones because I do not know the complicated josekis either. I'm not someone who likes to play those josekis, and I can avoid it every game I play. Then number three, now you do not have to worry about those complicated AI josekis. They are for AI and professional players mostly, and 95% of the time you can avoid them. And number four, remember that josekis are actually part of opening moves, right? You only play josekis probably first 30, 50 moves. After 50 moves, when you're in mid-game fights, you don't really play josekis anymore. So they're part of opening, and remember the good opening moves, right? Corner closer, the approach, you can play on the side, you can do side extensions, you can jump toward the center, do the knight's move toward the center. All the basic moves that I covered in my previous chapter, those are still good knowledge for you. And good opening moves can compensate for your lack of joseki knowledge. And that's actually what I do, because I do not have very strong joseki knowledge, for a high-level amateur. Lastly, please reach out with questions. I hope this teaching and learning experience will be more collaborative because it is a very difficult topic. So you can comment below, comment on any video, or reach out to me via email. The email is herewegameofgo@gmail.com. It is in the About section on my channel. As always, thank you for your support, and I hope you have fun learning this chapter on josekis. Good luck, and thank you for watching.